If you want to know what becomes useless in an economic collapse, do not start with burned buildings. Start with respectable purchases. Start with the things decent people buy. Start with the objects and contracts that make a middle-class life look responsible while the system is still functioning. That is where the real damage hides. Most people imagine collapse theatrically. They imagine flames, looting, soldiers, empty shelves. Sometimes they get that. What they miss is the quieter violence. The account still exists, but you cannot touch it. The house still stands, but nobody will buy it. The car still runs. But fuel costs too much and parts do not exist. The degree still hangs on the wall, but the job market it was supposed to unlock has died. The insurance policy still pays, but what it pays can no longer buy a month of ordinary life. That is collapse, not everything disappearing. The relationship between money and reality breaking, that is the mother line for everything I am about to tell you. Economic collapse does not destroy the middle class by smashing its possessions. It destroys the middle class by turning the purchases it was told were prudent into stranded assets that no longer protect, produce liquidity, or preserve purchasing power when the system stops honoring the assumptions behind them. That is the line. Read it again. Because once you understand it, you stop asking childish questions like, what should I buy to look successful? You start asking the adult question, what am I really purchasing? And which assumptions must remain true for this thing to stay useful? That is the only question that matters in an era like this. And most people never ask it while they still have the freedom to ask it calmly. They ask it only after the freeze, after the devaluation, after the layoffs, after the lines outside the banks, after the property market stops clearing, after they discover that what was framed as safety was really a very concentrated bet on systemic stability. That is the trap. This is why I do not want to give you a soft answer, because collapse does not punish everyone equally. It punishes the class most integrated into the formal system. The poor already live closer to cash, improvisation, barter, and necessity. The very rich own harder claims, wider jurisdictions, and more optionality. The people in the middle are the ones most obedient to the script. They signed the mortgage, they financed the car, they paid into the policy, they borrowed for the degree, they furnished the lifestyle, they trusted the institution. That is why they get hit hardest when the institution itself becomes the problem. Now, let me show you the first mechanism. I call it the stability mirage. The stability mirage is what happens when a purchase feels safe because the world around it still functions, even though its usefulness depends entirely on institutions, pricing signals, and refinancing conditions that can vanish much faster than the owner can adapt. Definition is simple. You do not really own utility. You own utility plus assumptions. A house is not simply a house. It is shelter plus credit markets, buyer demand, tax policy, employment stability, and the owner's ability to carry the cost. A car is not simply mobility. It is mobility plus fuel distribution, spare parts, wage stability, and access to insurance and maintenance. A pension is not simply future income. It is future income plus currency integrity, institutional solvency, regulatory continuity, and political restraint. That is the mirage. People confuse the object with the system that keeps the object useful. Then the system breaks and they act shocked that the object did not save them. That is not because they were stupid. It is because the culture trains people to think in possessions and not in dependencies. I want you to think in dependencies always, because dependencies are where collapse shows up first. Now let me take you into the first of the 5 purchases. Real estate bought at the wrong point in the cycle. This is the purchase people defend most fiercely because property has more mythology attached to it than almost anything else in personal finance. They are not making more land. Your home is your greatest asset. Property always comes back. Those lines sound wise because they are repeated so often. Repetition is not proof. A house can be a wonderful thing. A house can also become a trap. It depends on the system wrapped around it. That is the part almost nobody teaches. Honestly, a property purchased with heavy leverage at a cycle peak is not just a house. It is a long-duration bet on stable income, functioning credit markets, liquid resale demand, and a government too sane to raise your carrying costs while the economy is already punishing you. When those conditions fail, the house does not save you. It pins you down. Look at Japan after the bubble. The whole mythology there had become almost religious. Land scarcity, imperial urban pricing, multi-generational mortgages that people treated like serious planning instead of evidence of insanity. Then the bubble broke, and it did not politely mean revert. It ground lower, and lower and lower. Not for a year or two, but for a period so long that families discovered a truly cruel fact. A property can survive longer than a bad entry can be forgiven. That is devastating, because once a house is worth materially less than the debt tied to it, the asset stops feeling like stability and starts feeling like a sentence. The owner cannot leave easily, cannot sell cleanly, cannot reset. He becomes loyal to a balance sheet that no longer loves him back. The same logic showed up in America after 2008. People talk about subprime because it sounds like somebody else's mistake. Fine. A lot of perfectly ordinary households were not reckless gamblers. They bought the family home near the top because the entire social machine told them that was what decent adults did. Then prices fell, then liquidity froze, then refinance windows closed, then millions discovered that a house is only liquid when the system feels like granting you a buyer. That is the hard truth. The house itself was not broken. The market around it was. And when the market around it broke, the thing people thought was their foundation became a non-liquid liability with taxes, maintenance, insurance, and debt service still attached. That is a completely different experience from owning an asset. Greece taught the same lesson in a harsher fiscal voice. Property values fell, yes. More importantly, transactions froze. Governments short on revenue looked at immovable assets and saw tax targets. That is what heavily indebted states do. They hunt what cannot run. So the owner gets trapped twice. He cannot sell the asset at a decent price, and he cannot stop feeding the state through it. Argentina taught it again. Holiday homes, second homes, prestige homes. Any property not tied to raw necessity suddenly became absurdly difficult to monetize once the country itself was fighting for oxygen. People do not buy dreams when the system is choking. That is what owners learn too late. The mechanism is brutally simple. Real estate becomes useless in collapse, not because brick and concrete lose all physical value, but because the financial architecture that turns property into a useful reservoir of wealth disintegrates exactly when the owner needs access most. That is the line. The house still stands, the wealth does not. Now let me show you the second purchase, the new car bought on credit. A car feels more practical than real estate. That is why this one is so revealing. A car looks like mobility, autonomy, adulthood, a sensible modern tool, and in normal conditions, it is. In collapse, it becomes a node in a broken network. That is the key. A car is never just a car. It is fuel, parts, insurance, road quality, import channels, repair labor, wage support, currency stability. Take one away and the machine becomes expensive. Take two or three away and it becomes dead weight. That is what happened in Venezuela. People rushed into cars not only as status objects, but sometimes as crude inflation hedges. Buy the car now because money is rotting. Reasonable enough until the ecosystem died. Now fuel is scarce even in an oil rich state because extraction, refining, and distribution are political and industrial systems, not fantasies. Now spare parts are impossible because imports require foreign currency and functioning trade lanes. Now tires cost more than many people earn. Now insurance is a joke because claims in a collapsing currency are fiction. Now the asset in the driveway is an ornament you still owe money on. That is one of the cruelest forms of middle-class destruction in all of collapse economics. The debt survives the utility. Cuba showed another version. Vehicles that could not be serviced became monuments to a vanished supply chain. The owner did not need philosophical insight. He needed a fan belt, a filter, a pump, a part no one could source anymore. That is how collapse works. It turns ordinary dependence into immobilization, and if the car was financed, the whole thing becomes even uglier, because a financed car is not mobility. It is a stream of future obligations placed on top of a machine whose usefulness depends on a world that may not survive the loan term. That is a very fragile arrangement. The middle class accepts it because the modern economy makes car debt feel normal. Normal is not the same thing as safe. It is only familiar. Familiarity sedates people. A new car on payments is one of the clearest examples of a purchase that flatters a stable system and humiliates a collapsing one. In a stable system, it says you are progressing. In a failing system, it says you converted flexibility into depreciation and then financed the conversion. That is a terrible trade. Now let me show you the third purchase, long-term financial promises. Life insurance, annuities, retirement accounts, pensions, all the products sold in the language of prudence. This is where the cruelty becomes almost elegant because these are the things responsible people buy. These are the things moral financial culture praises. delay gratification, pay premiums, make contributions, trust the institution, protect your future. Fine. Now, insert collapse into that promise chain. Everything changes. These products are denominated promises. That is what they are. They say, give us money now and we will pay you later. But what is later worth if the currency changed? What is the contract worth? If the institution is insolvent, what is the payout worth if the state rewrites the rules, seizes the assets, or honors the face value in a measuring stick that no longer buys real life? That is the issue. Weimar Germany made this unforgettable: policies paid. Pensions were honored on paper. The paper had died. That is all a lifetime of careful contribution got converted into money that could not buy the essentials it was supposed to secure. That is not a missed forecast. That is a structural betrayal built into fiat promises under stress. Argentina repeated the lesson through pension nationalization and inflation erosion. Lebanon repeated it through trapped deposits masquerading as dollars until account holders discovered that a dollar claim in a weak institution is not the same thing as a dollar in hand. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in modern finance. Most people never learn it until too late. The mechanism here is viciously simple. Long-term financial products become useless and collapse because they are claims on future nominal payment streams that depend on stable currency, solvent institutions, consistent law, and a political class willing to respect prior promises when fiscal pressure becomes unbearable. That is a long dependency chain. Collapse breaks dependency chains, that is what it does. And because responsible savers built their future inside that chain, they are the ones most deeply injured when it snaps. This is why I never confuse prudence with outsourced trust. You can be prudent and still be holding a very fragile promise. Those are not opposites. Now, let me show you the fourth purchase. The degree purchased as a labor market asset. This one makes people angry because education is treated almost as sacred in modern middle-class identity. So let us be precise. Knowledge is valuable. Skill is valuable. Learning is valuable. A credential is different. A degree is not knowledge itself. A degree is a passport into a labor market. That passport has value only if the labor market, the institutional hierarchy, and the wage premium attached to that credential still function when you arrive. That is the hidden bet. A degree financed with debt is a leveraged wager on the continuity of the economic system that is supposed to reward it. Soviet collapse exposed this brutally. Brilliantly educated people found themselves with qualifications built for a vanished administrative and industrial order. The intelligence remained. The market signal broke. Professors, engineers, scientists, planners all discovered a painful truth. You can still be competent and suddenly underemployed if the system your credential was built to serve no longer exists. Greece and Spain taught it again through youth unemployment and the collapse of credential premiums in a wounded economy. Families paid heavily to produce a future professional class. The jobs were not there, or they were there somewhere else. The country bore the cost, another country received the labor. That is a disastrous transfer. The debt holder keeps the liability, the labor market takes away the latter. That is what people miss. A degree becomes useless in collapse, not because learning stopped mattering, but because the credential was a code for a market structure that has now changed or disappeared. That is a very different thing. A skilled person can adapt if he has real skill. A credentialed person with no portable competence gets crushed. That is why I always separate the piece of paper from the underlying capability. Collapse punishes the paper harder. Now let me show you the fifth purchase. Consumer lifestyle goods financed as though stability were permanent. This one is the most revealing because it strips the middle-class dream down to its rawest form. The home theater, the designer furniture, the premium appliances, the upgraded kitchen, the beautiful electronics. The entire museum of finance comfort in normal times. These purchases feel like progress. They say you are building a life in collapse. They say something else. You converted liquid resources into depreciating objects that cannot feed you, move you, protect you, or be sold efficiently when the system gets cruel. That is the truth. Zimbabwe showed one form of this: spend the money before it loses value. Fine, but if the thing you buy cannot preserve liquidity, cannot be repaired, cannot be resold, and does not solve necessity, then you did not actually protect yourself. You just exchanged one form of vulnerability for another. Lebanon showed the debt side. The goods remained in the apartment, the payments remained in the mail, the salaries did not remain whole. That is a terrible mismatch. This is the deepest secret of consumer collapse. The things you buy to make life feel secure are often the first things that become irrelevant when security itself goes missing. The sofa does not hedge inflation. The entertainment system does not repair a broken banking channel. The renovated kitchen does not help if food, fuel, and medicine are the constraint. And if you finance those goods, you manage the worst trade of all. You borrowed future capacity to acquire objects whose utility collapses fastest once the economy loses coherence. That is a middle-class tragedy in one sentence. Now step back and look at the pattern. A home bought at the wrong time. A financed car, long-term financial promises. A degree treated as guaranteed income machinery. Consumer comforts bought on credit. Do you see what links them? These are not random. They are the 5 pillars of respectable integration into the formal system. That is why they fail together. The system sold them to you. The system validated them. The system assigned status to them. The system made them feel rational. Then when the system itself became unstable, everything built on top of it became a concentrated wager on the one thing that was no longer dependable. That is the hidden mechanism. The middle class does not get destroyed in collapse because it was evil or foolish. It gets destroyed because its wealth, mobility, identity, and future are tied most tightly to the formal promises of the system that is failing. That is what makes collapse so surgical. It is not random violence. It is architecture revealing itself. Now let me give you the 6th mechanism. I call it the middle class concentration problem. A lot of people think diversification means owning many things. That is too shallow. Real diversification means not, depending on one system variable. The middle class thinks it is diversified because it owns a home, a retirement account, a degree, a car, and a set of durable goods. That is not diversification if all 5 depend on the same underlying conditions. Stable currency, functional banking, working credit markets, predictable regulation, a labor market that still pays the premium, a government that does not confiscate, freeze, or debase. Those are the real exposures. If all your respectable purchases depend on them, then you are not diversified. You are clustered. Collapse exposes clusters. That is what it does. And this is why people who appeared careful often get destroyed, while people who looked unsophisticated sometimes survive better. The careful middle class was fully integrated. The poor had little to seize and often lived closer to informal adaptation already. The very rich had jurisdictional spread, hard assets, foreign holdings, and direct access to liquidity. The middle class had paperwork and belief. That is not enough in a systemic break. Now let me give you the 7th mechanism. I call it the rule, change shock. This is the part polite financial planning almost never wants to discuss long. Term purchases feel safe because people assume the rules will remain close enough to present rules. That is the hidden faith. But collapse is precisely the environment in which rules change. Capital controls, withdrawal limits, pension seizures, tax surcharges, mortgage terms becoming impossible to refinance, insurance payouts denominated in dying money, credential premiums evaporating, import restrictions. All of this is rule change, and rule change is what converts a sensible plan into a trap. That is why I keep saying the problem is not merely that something bad happens. The problem is that the terms under which your purchases were supposed to justify themselves get rewritten after you are already committed. That is devastating. A 30-year mortgage is one thing in a stable financial world. It is another thing in a regime of devaluation, tax grabs, and frozen housing liquidity. A pension contribution is one thing in a solvent institutional environment. It is another thing when the state needs the pool. A university loan is one thing in a growth labor market. It is another thing in an economy where the job ladder snapped. That is the rule change shock. And if you do not understand it, you will keep evaluating long. Term purchases as though the future will politely resemble the recent past. That is one of the most expensive assumptions a person can make. Now let me give you the 8th mechanism. I call it the optionality test. This is the question I wish more people ask before they make large commitments. Does this purchase increase my flexibility under stress or reduce it? That is the test. A good decision in a fragile age is not only about expected value in normal times. It is about what happens when normal times stop. Does the purchase make you more liquid or less liquid, more mobile or less mobile, more dependent on one institution or less dependent, more able to adapt or more pinned down? That is how serious people think. A collapse does not require prediction to protect against it. It requires structure. It requires preserving optionality. The more a purchase locks you into one place, one currency, one institution, one repayment stream, one labor market assumption, or one regulatory framework, the more careful you should be. That is the optionality test. And it reveals instantly why so many middle-class purchases become useless in economic collapse. Not because they are evil purchases, because they are inflexible purchases built for a world that assumed continuity. Now, let me make the identity flip explicit. Most people think the point of money is to prove progress through visible acquisitions. Wrong. The point of money in a fragile system is to preserve capability. That is the flip. Capability to move, capability to buy when forced sellers appear, capability to transact outside one frozen pipe, capability to endure a currency event, capability to adapt when the labor market changes, capability to say no to desperation. That is wealth. A lot of middle-class consumption is the opposite. It turns capability into display. Display feels good until the system tightens. Then capability wins. That is why I do not measure intelligence by what a person owns in a stable decade. I measure intelligence by what still matters when the decade turns unstable. Now let me tell you the operating system I would use. First, stop treating every respectable purchase as inherently prudent. Second, identify the assumptions underneath each long-term commitment. Third, stop confusing nominal ownership with useful liquidity. Fourth, separate real skill from credential dependence. Fifth, measure every major purchase against the optionality test. Sixth, understand that the system selling you the purchase has no incentive to warn you about the systemic risk. The purchase depends on. Seventh, do not assume rules will stay fixed through stress. That is the operating system, not panic, not cynicism structure. Now let me say something even harder. This is not a call to live like a hermit. It is not a call to never own property, never study, never insure, never buy durable goods. That would be childish. The lesson is sharper than that. Know what you are really buying. Know how many invisible conditions must remain true for the purchase to perform the role you imagine it performing. Know how concentrated your exposure has become to one system variable, stability itself. That is the adult version of prudence. Most people never get there. They stay inside the script. And because they stay inside the script, they mistake cultural approval for actual resilience. That is a terrible trade. Now let me put the blade into this as cleanly as I can. Economic collapse does not usually make your purchases disappear. It does something more sophisticated and more cruel. It leaves them there and removes the system that made them useful. That is why the middle class suffers so deeply. The apartment is still there. The car is still there. The policy is still there. The diploma is still there. The beautiful things are still there. What is missing is convertibility, liquidity, earning power, institutional trust, and the ability to turn those respectable possessions back into real life when real life gets expensive. That is the real autopsy. And if you remember nothing else from what I said, remember this: the 5 purchases that become useless in collapse are the 5 purchases most praised by a stable consumer system. That is not an accident. It is the design flaw. See the flaw early, and you still have choices. Miss it. And one day you will stand in a perfectly intact room full of expensive things and realize the system has moved on without them.